Hi, I'm going to be talking about mixing plaster a little bit and making positives out of clay and out of plaster, and while using various things to kind of determine the shape of your form. So right here I have a bucket that has about a quart, or not about, it does have a quart of water in it, and I've measured out exactly 2 3/4 pounds of pottery plaster. This is my preferred ratio. Sometimes you might find instructions to add a quart of water and 3 pounds of plaster, and in my experience, the only major difference between that and the ratio that I use is that sets up a little bit faster. Interestingly, it's not the addition of the plaster to the water that actually causes the reaction that makes the plaster start solidifying. It's actually the agitation. So I could add plaster to my water very, very gently, and not move it, and it would not start setting up. It would just rest, and it wouldn't actually start solidifying and going through that chemical process until I started agitating it. So now I have my plaster in my bucket. It should rest for about 3 minutes to fully saturate the plaster with water. And then after about 3 minutes, the plaster will be presumed to be fully saturated, and then for pretty much exactly 3 minutes, I'm going to want to agitate my plaster. So that's what I'm doing now. If you have a large volume, you may want to agitate it with a drill with the plaster mixing attachment attached to the end. If you do it that way, please do make sure that you don't agitate it too quickly. You don't want to create a vortex with the drill in the center that causes the drill to add additional air bubbles to your plaster. So you want to try to keep air from kind of entering your plaster, because any air bubbles that actually touch your surface will be a sort of imperfection in your mold or your positive. So right now I'm going to be agitating for about 3 minutes. I'm going to actually, just while I'm agitating with the one hand in this video, I'm going to use my other hand to talk about a little bit about the different ways that I'm going to be making positives today. So I'm going to be talking and agitating at the same time. So my first means of making a plaster positive is just to pour my plaster into a container that I will then utilize to carve the plaster. So I'm just making a solid piece of plaster that I will go back and carve later. I'm looking at this piece, and I have another bowl right next to me that's also plastic. So, and I'm kind of getting a little more excited about using that one. So I think I'm going to use this one right here, which I did originally have my plaster in. So I think I'm going to put pour my plaster in this to just so it can hold a shape that I can then play around with and alter. And then my second positive that I will demonstrate today is I have spent some time making a lot of folds and tucks in this piece. This was actually a manila file folder, so a piece of paper, and it gives a really irregular but specific kind of folded paper look that I'm interested in trying to make a positive with. Additionally, I'm making as you think about ways to make positives, I'm sure, especially those of you who are very familiar with working with clay, are thinking, why doesn't Sahai just talk about using malleable clay? And that's certainly an option. Over here I have a bowl that I threw on the wheel, and I will take it off when it's leather hard and carve a foot in the bottom. And I could make a bowl that I slip cast that looks very much like bowls that are thrown. And when you look in the samples of student bowls from past semesters, which is on Canvas, you'll see that some people have done that to really amazing effect. And then the last thing I have that I also made out of clay on the wheel is this piece, which is thrown solid. Now this solid one I think is maybe one of the most simple kind of forms that I could make a mold out of. I just have it's just the outside of the bowl and this lip right here, which will help me make much nicer lips at the top, which I will be talking about in a separate lecture. But yeah, so this one is just drying right now. So some details about making positives out of a malleable clay is that the clay either needs to be bisque fired and sealed with shellac really, really well, or the clay needs to be leather hard. You absolutely cannot make a mold off of a piece of clay that is bone dry, because it needs to be non-porous. So you can make it non-porous by keeping it at the leather hard stage, in which case the water that's still in the clay makes it non-porous, or you can fire it and seal it so that it's no longer porous, or you could even glaze it and glaze fire it and then use that as your positive. So this is actually a bowl that I slip cast and fired, but I just used a bowl that as my positive, which was something I found at a thrift store. So I made this bowl, but it really looks just like one that I purchased at the thrift store. So I'm mostly wanting to talk to you guys about my paper mold here and seeing what kind of interesting things I might be able to pull off with this particular object here. It's not going to be very symmetrical. It's definitely going to be a multiple part mold, not a single part mold. Whereas this one here, I think I can make it in a one, if not a 2-part mold, and it should be pretty simple to pull off. So in some ways, this is my simplest positive that I have here to demonstrate with, and even the one that I threw that's not trimmed yet, that one's going to be at least a 2-part mold, one for the inside and one for the outside. With the plaster that I'm working with right now, I'm just showing you how to make a couple different kinds of positives. So right now, I'm just kind of talking because I'm waiting for my plaster to set up a little bit more, because the paper is pretty fragile. I'm a little bit nervous about pouring it when the plaster is still really liquid. So I'm waiting for it to really start settling. I can't really show you this, but if you've ever noticed the weight created by a boat traveling fast across water, what I'm looking for in my plaster is when I run my finger across the top, I see the impression of my finger just in a very subtle way staying on the top of the plaster. So I'm just starting to get that. But I'm going to agitate for another 15 seconds because this thing is very unstable. I've actually set it in a little bit of clay at the bottom, but while it's setting, I'm probably going to need to be supporting it with one of my hands. And I could spring a leak, so I want to make sure that my plaster is going to set up really fast, so the risk of that is diminished a little bit. So a few more seconds of agitating. And now let me check the wake on my wake is more pronounced, which tells me I have about 2 to 3 minutes before my plaster is going to completely solidify. Okay, so I don't know, I know just from looking that how much plaster I think I have. I don't know how full I'll be able to do my second plaster shape, but here I am pouring my plaster into paper. So pretty kind of tenuous operation here. So I'm really crossing my fingers and hoping that my plaster will set really nice and quickly. I'm also kind of pulling the form a little to try to make it a shape that I think I'm going to like to work with later on. So I'm pulling on one corner, pouring my plaster in. But I can't walk away from this. This is, like, as I said, fairly tenuous operation right here. The kind of thing that I want to do when I would only want to pour this when I knew my plaster was really just about to solidify. So I'm holding it and crossing my fingers that I don't spring a leak or it doesn't fall over before it really sets and becomes like whipped cream. It's almost there. And I do want to fill this bowl with the remainder of my plaster. So I'm going to do it back over here. You may not actually be able to see my pouring all that well. But now I'm just going to wait. And I'm hoping that I will be bringing both of these to class and then talking about how you might go through the next step of actually turning these into a mold that can be slip cast. But right now, that's the end of this video. Thank you.